family thinks I'm crazy, a podcast where I, your host, try to give you some tips on how you can explain all this weird, wild, crazy conspiracy stuff to the people you love most. Because that's what I've been trying to do for the past 10 years with no success.
I've been telling everybody that our government is shady, but every time I do, my family thinks I'm crazy. The hollow earth, UFOs, aliens invading, fluoride in the water, they spray our skies daily. When I talk about these things, they think I'm crazy. There's no escaping anymore the evil that we're facing. Illuminati mind control, they're sacrificing babies. The end of days, but anyways, my family thinks I'm crazy.
What, they don't want to listen to you?
No, they don't want to listen. They don't want to hear it. They're just like, oh, here we go, Mark. Off again with your...
Mark being Mark again.
Yeah. So, that's the thing about podcasts is when you're on the air, it's like therapy, If I can't talk to my family about this stuff, I'll talk to you, Matt, and all our listeners.
You just tell your whole podcast.
Yeah. So who are we talking about today, Matt?
They think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. My family thinks that I'm crazy.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. I'm your host, Mark Palmer, and on today's podcast, we have really a brilliant man, someone who's come in and saved a lot of people a lot of headaches with his fantastic service, Content Safe. You can find all the information about Content Safe at contentsafe.co. But that's just a little bit of what we got into today. I mean, people who have a podcast or a YouTube channel and they don't want to risk losing it, one night, one day, all your content on your channel can be lost. Well, guess what? Matt Raymer, my man, my friend, contentsafe.co, his company, is here to help you. Here to help you back up your content so that if you are railing against the machine or if you are saying things that the big brothers or big daddies out there don't want us to be talking about, well, Matt Raymer's going to back that content up and make sure that, it can get deleted from YouTube, but there's nothing stopping you from republishing it somewhere else because you have the files backed up. Now, for those who don't know, Matt is down in the Philippines. He's lived in the Philippines for the past half of his life. He met his wife in the Philippines and decided to stay. And I found this conversation so fascinating. I've never been to that part of the world. I'd like to visit one day. But yeah, the extent of my travel is I've been as far west as Denver and I've been as far south as D.C. I went to Florida when I was a kid, but I don't really count that because I was young and didn't really remember much. And now, since I've been about 20, around 20 was when I went to Denver, and now at 26, I've been to probably 10 or 12 different states, but my global travel has really been nil. I've never left the country, so this conversation was especially fascinating for me. Definitely inspiration to get out and fly and see another part of the world that I haven't seen before. But Matt and I talked about the inner workings of the Philippines. We talked about what COVID and the whole pandemic situation has been like in the Philippines. And then we got into some really interesting waters, talking about the ancient city of Manila and the ancient forgotten history of the Philippines, and it is a very, very complex history. This is a place that has a lot of resources, has a lot of gold. People who are World War II buffs, if you can even call yourself that, will remember that all that Japanese gold ended up in the Philippines, and people who know about history know that the Philippines has been, quote-unquote colonized for, from several different countries. And what you'll find from what Matt had to share is that you really cannot colonize the Filipino people. And they're not just one people. That's the other thing, is this homogenized New World Order idea that we all are one one type of people. No, we're all human beings, but we come in so many different varieties, shapes and sizes, and all of that beautiful, unique specialness that we all bring to the table blends together to make what it is to be human. And I think Matt elaborated on a part of the world that I've really only yet to experience. Tara and I had a really cool Filipino dish that she cooked up after we talked to Matt. And yeah, it's just on to the next journey from here, folks. Who knows? Maybe I'll end up in Mexico. Who knows? Maybe I'll end up in the Philippines. Maybe I'll end up in Alaska. Maybe you'll end up exactly where you need to be. Enjoy this conversation with Matt Raymer. You're listening to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And please, if you like what you hear, go on over, don't fear, on the Patreon/MFTIC. You can see what there is to be seen and all there is to be seen behind the scenes with our new project, Scene. Have I said scene enough times? Anyways, folks, I love you. Thank you for listening. Shout out to all of the great new faces on the Patreon. Our Patreon is growing, folks. Come on over. Gabby just joined in. We love you. Thanks for joining the family. To all our listeners across the globe, this one's for you. Enjoy this conversation with Matt Raymer. And please, again, go check out contentsafe.co. All right. Peace out, folks.
You can become part of that Highland Tribe just by being part of the community, being reliable, being liked by the community. You'll be considered part of the tribe. You're a Highlander because you were, accepted. That's the thing. It's not a blood thing or necessarily a familial thing. So Filipinos are really accepting of outsiders, extraordinarily accepting. So Metro Manila looks big, but this ancient city was bigger than Metro Manila. It went all the way north of West Manila to south of Manila. And we don't know who built them. Down in south of Manila in Cavite, which they found a Chinese pot and porcelain that predates Spain. Because apparently Cavite was a trading port for the Chinese. They've also found in northern Luzon these, I think they were made out of platinum, which is very unusual for something to be made out of platinum. And they said that these little, I don't know exactly what they called it, but it was a little sculpture made out of platinum that the Chinese emperor would issue to every governor of every province. And they found one of these things in northern Luzon, which means that at some point in the past, northern Luzon was considered to be a Chinese colony. And even the people at Kasai Sayan Hunters who published the video said, this is earth-shattering because if you could show that something was a Chinese colony, China is going to say they own it. That's really cool stuff going on here. I like to call the Philippines Little America because it's a melting pot. It really is. It's always been a melting pot.
Yeah. Since
time immemorial. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the really fascinating things you mentioned was the Batanes, they're the Batanes people, and how they have these really strange types of houses that resemble Celtic architecture, at least the same kind of houses you would find in that part of the world. So yeah, no kidding, it's a melting pot. I mean, people probably wouldn't guess that any Irish people had been in the Philippines before, the Spanish got there, right?
Right. And you know that there are Spanish journals that recount Caucasians being present in northeastern Luzon, which is just south of the Batanes that we're talking about.
Wow. And do they
Yeah.
have a
And
date
did you know
associated with that?
that would have been shortly after Magellan, the early Spanish conquerors?
Mm.
Let's see, Magellan was, we were just talking about this at breakfast the other day, what year? Magellan was 1521. And a lot of people don't understand how Magellan died. Magellan died doing one thing. Magellan died doing the one thing that a foreigner should never do in this country:
Uh-oh.
get involved in politics.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I've heard some bad things about the Duterte. Is that how you pronounce his name?
You know, Duterte is just one more incarnation of a whole series of people that are similar. This place is run by clan. I often say that the central government really doesn't control the country, and we kind of have a debate between me and my friends. If you talk to someone, and they'll never, I can't use their names because they're officials in the government. You talk to them about central control, and they say, no, actually, there is no central control here. It's mostly symbolic. But there is kind of this interplay, which is kind of cool, that we don't really have a state-based system. What we have are provinces, kind of like Canada. And at least on paper, those provinces are subject to the central government. But in reality, you have warlords or clans inside each province that have controlling interests. So, for instance, my wife's province, she's not native to our current location, but our wife's province, there's a certain family, we know their name, and their name is national. Even though they mainly have power in that region, their name is national. The Marcoses are a classic example of that. The Marcoses control northwestern Luzon. But they also have some interests because of Imelda down in the Visayas. But because of Ferdinand Marcos, that was northwestern Luzon. Right south of him is another guy by the name of Singson, and he controls that area. If you go over to the other side, I've forgotten the name of that guy. There's another guy that controls the other side of the island. And Manila is kind of like this confederation of different representatives from all of those groups. So the mountain people where I'm at they want to be autonomous, but officially they're not recognized as autonomous. But in reality, they're very autonomous. And if you were going to look for some of the most elite soldiers in the country, they come from those tribes. Because their history is headhunting. Yeah. Their ancestors were headhunters. So these guys are pretty drop-dead serious folk. And that's where you get into the Celtic influences. The Celts were headhunters.
Wow.
The people in northern Luzon, not all of them, but there are headhunters, or at least they were headhunters up here. The swords of Celts are very similar to the swords of the tribes up here. The ships.
Well, I was going to point out, from my martial arts training and the many different arts that I'm aware of, because that was a really strong point of fascination for me when I was studying martial arts, is what styles were around the world and how did they originate and what makes them unique in the Philippines. I mean, stick fighting is eskrima, is kind of like a dulled version of sword fighting, right? Because the idea is to not kill someone while you're practicing.
Well, it was, basically, and it was a way to kind of disguise that you knew how to you knew how to use a polo.
Right.
And both my son and my nephew are scream out people. So
Wow.
my nephew is more practical. He's the type that they learned how to do it in the provinces to actually kill people. But my son is more artistic. He knows how to do all the fancy tricks.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, there's definitely a flow and an art to it that's unlike, but you know, that's what makes each martial arts unique, is it's not just a fighting style. You see the culture of the area incorporated in, and even the spirituality of the area incorporated into the art.
There's a particular Filipino in Canada. I've forgotten his name. He was talking about Indigenous Dance and martial arts. And he was examining how the dance routines of some of these tribes imitate hitting Spanish armor in its weak points.
Mm.
You know, while the Spanish were here, they never actually conquered the country.
Right.
Because you get into the interior, like say in a mountainous area or what used to be thick jungle, it's very hard to subjugate the country. And to this day, that goes back to that whole lack of centralized control, because it's not only the terrain, it's also the community, and which is another aspect of warfare, is networks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting.
So they were practicing. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting the differences between the areas. I wonder if that plays into the martial arts styles as well.
I'm sure it does. I'm sure it does. Though there does seem to be a lot of commonality between the different regions and how they fight. But again, I would go for the indigenous folk. Those guys, they know how to fight. Right. Not too far from where I'm at is the Ifugao tribe. And these guys, they make knives. That's one of their trades. And my attorney described dealing with the Ifugao whenever they get angry at someone and how they murder people with their knives. Yeah. These guys are pretty serious folk.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's like anywhere. You know, I grew up in Kentucky, Indiana area, and I knew that there were places that you shouldn't go to. You hear stories about people being found in the forest, their bodies found in the forest. So yeah, I don't feel in danger here. I know the right people to stay out of trouble.
Yeah, right on. So maybe we can get into that a little bit. What got you to the Philippines from all the way out there in Kentucky?
It's a mixture of things, but you know, if you wanted to simplify it, it was my wife.
Yeah.
Yeah, mainly that was the reason. I was a pen pal with her in the early 90s, and that was when I was in graduate school in physics. And I had an opportunity to visit her and some other friends from graduate school, and I took it, and I proposed to her. I had sworn I would not, but I did. And over the course of the year, finished my graduate work. Well, not quite. I almost finished my graduate work. Then I came back. I got married. Then I went back and finished my graduate work. And then I came back again. And I was supposed to migrate with her back to the U.S. But after a year of waiting for her green card interview, we just decided we would stay.
That's awesome.
And that's the beginning of a long adventure.
Yeah.
I've often said, I have no regrets about the decision to stay here. It has been challenging, but, challenges are what make life interesting, right?
Matt, I love that. I love that story. I feel the love in the way you said that, and I'm sure your wife is beautiful, and that was a great decision to go there, man, because the Philippines, is a beautiful place too. I mean, what a place to have an adventure, you know? It's so exotic compared to Kentucky. I mean, I've been to Indiana, not Kentucky, and yeah, it's kind of plain. I mean, I prefer Connecticut over the Midwest, to be honest. I'm glad I grew up on the coast after seeing what the Midwest looks like. So I don't blame you for going out to the Philippines, not to slight any of our friends out in the Midwest, but
Well, I was generally kind of disheartened by Western culture back in the 90s. You could say I was an early culture war refugee.
mm.
So I don't think I consciously knew that until I got much older. But yeah, I would say that was part of it.
What were some of the forces at play in that culture war? I mean, I definitely have always considered myself counterculture, so
Well, I would say that I grew up, in my early teens and maybe even before my teens, kind of very passionate about the sciences and very idealistic about the sciences. And I got into the sciences. I actually have a bachelor's in physics and computer science and math. And I'm actually published in biophysics. I was participating in computational biophysics in my 20s. In fact, I was involved, when I got out of physics, I was involved in the early computer graphics movements. I was involved in some early ray tracers for 3D rendering of images and scenery. There was a lot of cool stuff back then. We think all the cool stuff's now, but actually all the cool stuff started back then. And what I encountered as I went through that was just how unidealistic the whole endeavor was and how corrupted the sciences were. And that really disheartened me. I had a department head that was caught falsifying the student evaluations of the other professors. I won't mention any names, but yeah, he was tenured. He had like 80 papers to his name. He was very smart. The politics within the department made him do something like that because they just didn't like one another.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I had my own advisor, undergraduate advisor, my research boss. I had him be scooped up and thrown out of the university with guys in black suits. To find out later it was retribution from one of the other factions because he reported them for improper disposal of nuclear waste.
Okay. Wow.
So you could say that I was very disheartened by what I saw, and
Yeah.
I just saw a lot of hypocrisy in the sciences, and I left. And I was looking like, whenever I met my wife, I was looking for someone who was tough enough to have an adventure with me, and I just generally felt that most of the women I met in the West were not tough enough to do that.
Yeah.
And my wife is definitely tough enough.
Yeah, no, I mean, after the intro to what, the culture of the Philippines looks like, at least in the way that, the movers and shakers are rolling, I don't blame her for being tough. It definitely sounds like the type of place where you got to stand up for yourself. Whereas out here, we kind of have the comfort or the illusion of safety, at least it seems. But, I mean, considering what we've just gone through with this plandemic, as I like to call it, I mean, it sounds to me from the, conversations we've had that it's pretty locked down over there. Would you say that the government holds a heavy fist when it comes to this whole pandemic? Because in Connecticut, I've been able to express my rebellion pretty freely up to the point of, not being able to wear or not being able to go into a grocery store without wearing a mask for some time. But that's just recently been lifted. So it's relatively, to me, it's back to normal.
Well, public expression is not the way that things work here. That's the one thing that I think a lot of Westerners don't understand. Yes, there is a lot of brutal suppression on social media. People are generally attacked if they speak out against the administration. I do have friends, though, that speak out all the time, and they don't feel any repercussions. But again, it goes back to things being different here. Those people are connected. They have classmates or family members that are extremely powerful. So no one will really, punish them because they're afraid of their connection. As far as lockdowns, I would say the same thing that I said with Ricky on his show, that what you see in the news is not actually what's going on the ground.
Mm. Right.
There are a lot of people following protocols here, but a lot of them it's half-hearted. The official protocol until last week, I've been told, because I never watched the news. I just look at what's in front of me. I don't watch the news. It's too deceptive. The official protocol was face shields and masks everywhere, including your home.
Including your home.
But including your home. Yeah. And I only know like 1 in 1,000 that actually followed that.
Yeah.
And if you go outside, right, most of the people have the face shield flipped up.
Okay.
It's not in front of their face. And then another percentage of the people have the face mask underneath their chin.
Yeah.
And not up here. So there's a lot of non-compliance. But you're not going to see Filipinos go out you'll see some go out and protest, but you're not really going to see them protest verbally out loud. That's why I get a little frustrated at expats who migrate here, especially people who migrate here when they're older. See, I came here, I was still in my 20s. I've had a chance to kind of like grow up here. And I think I understand better than most expats how things work here. It's all very subtle. I've seen guys say, that they're going to put up with this forever and they're just going to roll over and take it. No, they're not rolling over and taking it. Yeah. They're not. Things here are about sabotage. That's how things work here. You're not going to see, it's just going to be things are going to break, they're going to stop working. You're not going to see outward rebellion.
Yeah. Wow.
So I'm not too worried about them.
I love, the way you said that. We need to hit on that. Sabotage. Things here are about sabotage. And it does feel like there is like a deceptive, almost pirate-like nature to the way you're talking about the clans, and maybe this is just my fantastical thinking, but is there some truth there?
Oh, that's the absolute truth. Let me. I don't know if I would say that this happens right now, but I know not too long ago, if someone was doing too many pickpocketings in the public market, you would see someone's disembodied hand hanging from a walkway.
Yeah. Wow.
Yes. Wow. Yeah. Tied from a string hanging from the public walkway. It's like, stop picking pockets here. I've seen an occasion where someone snatched someone's cell phone, and the whole street erupted whenever they identified who the guy was, and he was like kicked to the ground, and it didn't require any police at all. It was done just by the public.
Now, what you're bringing to mind is sort of a decentralized landscape. I really feel like where I'm at, I would call it a megalopolis, right? I'm smack dab in the middle of two of the biggest cities in the United States, right? Boston, New York City, and then we got Philadelphia down there as well. So there's a lot of energy that's urban, but there's some, more native, indigenous, natural energy that lies beneath. But given that potency of the land, and the adventure that you've taken, what have you found in the sense of like maybe the folklore, anything you've uncovered?
Well, the most fascinating stuff is the ancient things that have happened here that we don't, and you'll see some Filipino academics that try to point this out. It's like the channel. These guys are pointing out how history has really been robbed from people here. There are ancient artifacts, gold, ornate, intricate gold necklaces that are like this thick around, solid gold that they have found that are hundreds of years, they predate Spain. Well, that's because the country has the second largest under the ground resources in gold of any country. A lot of people don't know that. We're very rich in gold and silver and copper, but I think it's the one economist, I've forgotten his name, conservative economist. I'll remember his name later. He points out that the countries with the most resources in the ground tend to be the poorest.
Well, yeah, and I mean, look at the history of the Philippines. I mean, what I've learned about it from my American, education, the history is that, oh, well, this place existed and Spanish came and they made it a part of the world, and then, then America went over there and they colonized it. So it is sort of a colonized place, and yeah, that tends to be the theme, unfortunately, but
I remember whenever I was researching before I came here to live, and there was an old Encyclopedia Britannica that said something to the effect that the Catholics tried to subjugate the Filipino spiritualism for nearly 400 years, and what they ended up with was that the Filipinos co-opted Catholicism. And I think that there is some truth to that native practices overwhelm anything that comes in from the outside.
Yeah.
So, things like law, well, law has to adapt to the way things work here and not vice versa.
Right.
And that I don't want to paint too much of a anarchical utopia picture because we got our issues. Yeah. We got people who conform just like anyone anywhere else.
Right.
And it's a shame that with the the stabbing and all of that we're seeing people that they should know better, but they went ahead and done it. And I don't know, mixed feelings there. I hope that there aren't any ill consequences to them, but I'm concerned that there will be. And see, that's the concern. One of the concerns I have here about that issue is that if enough people become convicted that they were fooled, oh boy, that's going to get bloody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that will get bloody.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so many things are coming to mind. I hope that doesn't happen, but the point about gold and resources and it being a very interesting place to these European nations at that time in history. I mean, the name Philippines itself, my guess is that comes from a European word. Maybe I'm wrong.
King Philip.
Right. So
King Philip was right.
What would the people there, I mean, obviously it's an island chain, so there's many different clans, like you said, but was there a common people in that? Yeah, exactly. So now this homogenization has taken place there where, they're all Philippines, when in reality, like you said, they're clans, provinces, and each has their own sort of subculture that's unique to the area.
Well, what's interesting to me is that the whole idea of geneticity is foreign. From my perception, okay, it's foreign to here. Let's say that you're from the mountains, or let's say that you were born near the ocean in the lowlands, and you, for some reason, found yourself in the highlands. Maybe you married a Highlander, or you just migrated up there for trade or something like that. Well, you can become part of that Highland tribe just by being part of the community, being reliable, being liked by the community. You'll be considered part of the tribe. You're a Highlander because you were, accepted. That's a thing. It's not a blood thing or necessarily a familial thing. So Filipinos are really accepting of outsiders, extraordinarily accepting. But I will make one caveat there. For the first 6 months to, say, a year, people will bend over backwards to be accommodating and nice to you. But once they begin to accept you as part of the community, that's whenever they stop being so nice.
Isn't that the
They
way
can
it
be
is?
very brutal. Yeah, they can be very frank, very brutal in their comments. And a typical thing if you're an expat, you try to learn Tagalog or Ilocano is, well, either they'll tell you, you don't need to learn that because I can speak English, right? Or they will mock you whenever you have bad pronunciation. And that's just a very Filipino trait. They'll just mock you and make fun of you for mispronouncing words.
Yeah. I for whatever reason that really resonates with me. I think, maybe it's a New England type thing, but we're ball busters, when you get to know someone around here and you like someone, you pick on them a little bit, and it's out of love because there's always room for improvement. At least that's the philosophy that I've gained. I don't know if everyone sees it that way, but it is very instinctual, at least growing up around here, to have that.
And that's
a human thing.
That is the unfortunate thing if you get too sensitive. And this is one of my problems with at least the current Western society is it's become, in some circles, too sensitive. You can't say anything. You can't tell a joke. You can't, nobody has any wherewithal or tolerance to handle that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember as a kid in elementary, my classmates were cruel.
Yeah. Yeah, same here. And I mean, I had the sort of obvious contrast when I went from being kind of in a blue-collar suburb, but on the water, so not totally blue-collar, but I'm definitely blue-collar. And then I go and work in New Haven, go to school in New Haven, where Yale University is, this very prestigious place. And that's exactly what I noticed, is these people just didn't have the same sense of humor I did. And it was a little off-putting in the sense of like, oh yeah, they're taking themselves very seriously. And the more I learned about conspiracy and all of these sorts of truths about what Yale University is and was and how it started to really make me feel a little passionate and upset to kind of shove it in their face and be like, well, how smart are you? Because, what you're doing is just contributing to this massive drug trade. And I don't know how much of them are aware of that. But, I mean, you go walk around the city of New Haven and the biggest building that isn't a bank building is a pharmaceutical company. And then every other large building is a hospital for the university. So that you can see it's very obvious where the money is in New Haven. And they tore down the Coliseum.
It's kind of like
Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. But it's kind of like while we were preparing breakfast this morning, I was listening to Jimmy Dore, and he was talking about a speech from Biden in which he was criticizing Russia for getting involved in elections, and Biden said, imagine if the United States got involved in some other country's election. And Dore's like, wait a minute, we admit that we've been involved in like hundreds of incidents, including assassination of people.
Yeah.
This is another thing that drove me crazy about the West, is that I was like, no, that's not right. I don't want to be a party to that. That's terrible.
Right.
The things we've done, and I do recognize that if it were another culture that got in the same position, they would probably do the same thing. I think humans are pretty much the same everywhere. But I've always had a thing for the underdog. I don't like bullies.
I agree with you there. Yeah, for sure. I think it is interesting. I don't know if I could leave America. I do have a sense of awe for the magic of the land, and I think there is still room for improvement everywhere. But
for sure.
in the light of the magic of the land, I mean, I really am interested to hear more about the Philippines, as much as you've gathered about, maybe maybe the ancient history, one guest that we just had on the show, Ari Asalin, he's really, out there. He's got some awesome theories that I don't think most people have heard about, but they're concerning mud flood, and he's connecting a lot of the stuff from the electric universe and the Tartarius stuff. And one of the things he mentioned was there was this very strong electromagnetic weapon like lightning that was used to destroy islands. And what came to mind were all these broken up island chains. We have them in the Philippines, where apparently, according to some books that I've read, a place that used to be known as Lemuria, right? It existed maybe when the ocean was significantly lower. And then also you see the same thing in, the Bermuda area with all these broken up islands.
Well, the thing to remember about here is that there's this impression that the cultures pre-Spain were very primitive, and they weren't. Right. They were quite sophisticated cultures. Culturally, I think that, I don't necessarily think I like some of the practices of the ancient cultures, but I won't get into that today. The other thing to remember or to know is that recently they found these places they call the black sands. And there are these little wall structures around Manila Bay. They appear to be ancient seawalls. And the extent of this goes on to the land where they find canals. This is a megacity bigger than Manila. Metro Manila, right? So Metro Manila looks big, but this ancient city was bigger than Metro Manila. It went all the way north of West Manila to south of Manila. And we don't know who built them.
Wow. How much do we know about the seawalls? Is there any information about what they're made of, or any size measurements that have been done?
What's been done has been by the academics. They're not the official state organs, right? They're not the University of the Philippines, but they do cooperate with the University of the Philippines to try to confirm what they're looking at. And there are no Spanish journals about these structures, and they ran across them accidentally because one of the people had a class that they were teaching, and his student said that she was coming from Manila Bay. And he said, how could you possibly be living in Manila Bay? And she said, our barrio is at the edge of the ocean in Manila Bay. He's like, really? Can you show me? And she took him out there, and they drone flew over the area, and there are old churches and homes, and they're on these artificial, not naturally occurring islands, and it looks like it was a seawall. And then further research showed the canals in Bulacan, which is north of Manila, and you've got things down in south of Manila in Cavite, which they found Chinese pots and porcelain that predate Spain.
Wow.
So apparently Cavite was a trading port for the Chinese. They also found in northern Luzon these, I think they were made out of platinum, which is very unusual for something to be made out of platinum. And they said that these little, I don't know exactly what they called it, but it was a little sculpture made out of platinum that the Chinese emperor would issue to every governor of every province. And they found one of these things in northern Luzon, which means that at some point in the past, northern Luzon was considered to be a Chinese colony.
Wow.
And even the people at Kasai-Sayan Hunters who published the video said, this is earth-shattering, because if you could show that something was a Chinese colony, China is going to say they own it.
Right. Right. Well, China, if you're listening, you didn't hear from us.
Yeah, well, you did. We weren't the first ones to say it. It's out there. But Batanes that we talked about earlier is worth commenting on. The Celtic connection is, wow, it's amazing. As I've already said, there's the connection of headhunting, which, if you took that by itself, it wouldn't really be all that much. But you pile on top of that the similarity of sword making and the similarity of boat making. In Batanes, the boat style is different than the rest of the country. The rest of the country uses the type of pontoon boat, with the balancing arms on the boat.
Right.
Whereas the boat style in Batanes is a classic Celtic boat shape.
Right.
The graves are shaped like boats, which none of the graves in the rest of the country are shaped like that. Lodge houses are shaped like Celtic lodge houses. There's no similarity to the architecture of the rest of the country. You just pile these things on top of one another, and you kind of come to the conclusion that it's reasonable to think that there's some sort of Celtic influence.
Yeah.
Which then tells you that there was a lot of international or global scale travel and commerce in the ancient world, more than we think. And I'll add you one that's not related to the Philippines, is the Caucasians of northern Japan.
All right. Yeah. Tell me more about that. That's new.
They're no longer a tribe, but almost every Japanese can find some DNA within them that traces back to this tribe. And the tribe, they were all white. They were northern Japan. I've forgotten the name of the tribe, but it's a thing. You talk to the Japanese and they know about it. So what you had was a perhaps Celtic, maybe, origin.
Wow.
So, and if you think about the oldest skeleton found in North America, human remains, it's actually a Caucasian.
Yeah. What, and can you elaborate on that? Because I was unaware of that.
See, that's a very controversial finding because it kind of undercuts the idea that the Asiatics were the first people in North America.
Right.
This was found out, I think, back in the 80s. I've forgotten the exact location where it was found, but the skeletal remains were definitely Caucasian. They were not Asiatic. Now, that said, I'm not an ethno-nationalist. I obviously don't have any convictions along that way, and I'm not an ethno-superiorist either. I think that I'm very skeptical about demographic data on intelligence, and I'm very skeptical about the measure of intelligence itself anyway. It's just that it is, to me, more indicative that the world is much more complicated and that the ancient world was much more mixed than we give it credit. And maybe perhaps this whole idea of blood segregation or genetic segregation is an innovation, and it does not have an end. It's not really established in antiquity. I don't think people have always thought that way.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No, yeah, you're definitely speaking my language. I'm someone who believes that, the universality of certain archetypes within all cultures shows us that, there's definitely a conscious link. I don't think that consciousness is measured by physical definitions of whatever body it's in. I think that depending on the landscape that the person or human evolves to, that determines the nature of their intelligence. And, somebody from Paris gets plucked out of Paris and dropped in the middle of, western deserts of the, China. They're not going to be able to survive, but that Mongolian horse rider who's over in the Gobi Desert all the time, and, he can survive there. But you take him and you pluck him and you put him in Paris, he's probably going to have a hard time figuring things out. Maybe he'll
Right.
not die like the guy that got plucked in the desert, but he'll probably be left with, a feeling of existential dread that most people in the West seem to be cultivating.
But some people can adapt. I remember a story about an Australian Aborigine that was brought to Britain, and he adapted, got a degree from Oxford, and
Well, yeah, no, and I'm really, my point is like intelligence. It's not defined by who you are. It's defined by how it's applied. And our environment is where we apply our intelligence.
Mm-hmm. I think there's something also to be said about the plasticity of intelligence, the ability to adapt. This is something I think that's sorely missing in the West, is the ability to adapt to changing environments. Whereas maybe other places, people have to adapt to changing environments. I remember a Swiss friend of mine that has been here longer than me. He's been here almost 40 years. He said that he left Switzerland because everything was predictable in Switzerland. He said it's like clockwork. He said like a Swiss clock. He said everything happens whenever it's supposed to happen, and there are no surprises. And here, he said, it's never boring. He said it's like there's something new every day, and things don't ever go according to plans.
Yeah, and isn't that how life happens?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's part of what was so disruptive about the last year and a half for some people, was that they were accustomed to regularity, and that things happened when they were supposed to happen, and things were predictable, and you suddenly got thrown into a completely unpredictable mess, and there were certain people who just couldn't cope with that.
Yeah, I was not one of them. I definitely feel like that benefited me in some way, and I don't mean to boast about it and make fun out of other people's misery, but it definitely was an opportunity for those who seized it.
Well, I've heard it said more than once that they would say, I'm thank goodness for COVID, that opportunities emerged, and I know that's unfair because there were quite a few people that it wasn't a blessing for them. But maybe it goes back to that plasticity thing. Maybe, I've often said here, by and large, the people who suffered here were the ones who complied. And I think it's the same everywhere, though I can only speak for here.
Now, one thing I really wanted to ask you, because this would be a really great, examination of it from a better perspective. Something that I felt, something that my girlfriend had felt before COVID, is this sense of like uplifting of the consciousness. Like things were lining up in a way, and then it was like almost like the crown chakra was opening, and then all of a sudden the crown virus hits us, and things got, another swell of fear came in. But on that spiritual, intuitive level, do you think that there was, would you say you felt something like that in the air pre-COVID?
Sure. Maybe for a few years, because, for me, I would say, and we talked about this, I believe, in our other calls together, that I knew that I had been given a certain level of awareness of how the world worked, even starting out fairly early in my life. But I was pretty much a normie until my late 30s. Even though I was aware of these things, I was like on the fence. But since 2010, it's just been each year accelerating, that my awareness just keeps getting wider and wider, to the point where you can look at a situation and you can say, I think I know the trick in this situation. Whereas before you would say, well, it's just what they said it was. No, I can't look at things that way anymore. I look at things from the standpoint of, no, there's a trick here somewhere. And then you just pick through it and you find, oh, that's what the trick is.
And in the age of Aquarius, once we've left the age of duality, the Pisces, Aquarius is the water bearer. When you pour water over something, it clarifies it, with every pour, the more dirt is sifted out and you see, a clearer picture every time. That's at least what comes to mind when I think of the Aquarian energy, and that's what they said was happening in the 60s, way before I was born. But I definitely feel like whatever happened in that period, 2010 for me, not so much. Maybe that was around the time I started smoking weed, but I was also in high school, so it's like, I think I was sophomore year 2010, and but by 2012, the year I graduated, I had definitely, I wasn't the average student per se, my interest, but yeah, I was definitely opening myself up to this, and I think it wasn't by accident. I think that there was this wave that I kind of took part in.
If you look at my own family history, as I alluded to just a moment ago, what I believe opened the eyes of my parents were very late World War II generation. For example, my father was drafted into World War II and was on a ship headed to the Pacific, and they dropped the bombs on Japan. So he was like right there ready to go island hopping, and the war ended essentially. And he ended up in South Korea, cleaning up South Korea from Japanese control. Well, this is a person who grew up in what they call the greatest generation, right? He came out of World War II. He was still in his 20s whenever he came out. He went through that industrial boom where the U.S. was the only manufacturing power in the world, much like China seems to be now. That's why I often call it World War COVID. And then he started raising a family, and his eldest son, my brother, volunteered to go to Vietnam. Now that's how normy they were. My dad begged him to just go to Canada. But he, in good conscience, said he couldn't because he had friends dying in Vietnam. So he went and he died. Now that was an eye-opener for my parents. That's the first person who ever told me anything anti-establishment was my dad. And I still think that it was because of my brother. So that's the Aquarian age you're talking about there, right? It took a war to open his eyes, right? And for us, it was a little gentler for us. I think that the budding of social media and these video platforms were opened a lot of people's eyes. And to be honest, if you look at the current vaccination rates in the world, they're not getting vaccinated at the rate that I think they had planned.
Right, which is hope. Yeah, I that gives me hope. I mean, one of my friends that I podcast with often and talk to often, he makes these on-the-street videos where he just goes around and asks people in Dallas if they have gotten the vaccine. And I mean, it's really like 1 or 2 out of 10 people in his videos will say they've gotten it. But yeah, for the most part, people kind of giddy grin and say no, and it's entertaining now, I think. I don't know, maybe that's just like a small little picture of it. But Matt, go ahead.
Well, even here, the ones that are just jump at it are the people who are above 70. They jump at it because they've got this perception of the world that I think is flawed.
Yeah.
And they trust health officials. They trust that, no, they're never going to do anything that's going to hurt us. Well, that means you don't understand history very well.
Yeah. And
I've often said that this is not a matter of intelligence. It's a matter of faith. What do you have faith in? If you have faith in government, then you're probably going to get hurt in this situation.
Yeah. No, I mean, maybe when you said the anti-establishment comment, it brought to mind The times I've been, really, there's really no point in my life where I've been like faced with adversity from the government. Even getting pulled over and having weed on me, it was always very like, oh yeah, no big deal. Maybe that was just the happenstance of it, but the anti-establishment for me really came from like seeing what was going on in the world and wanting to make a change. And something you just touched on that I think is interesting, and you have a lot of experience in this area, is how the internet has opened a lot of people's eyes to so much. And that's part of my generation's upbringing. I think that's where, even though there's a lot of deception and programming going on in those realms, I was fortunate enough to kind of exist on the internet in this time where social media didn't exist yet. So, it was kind of the free internet, and there were all kinds of weird sites you can find and lots of great information from other genuine people. And so I found a lot of really interesting information that led me to gather all these books, because I quickly saw how fast some of those websites that had that great information were getting censored. So I'm like, well, a book can't get censored if I own it, so I started buying books. But I would even go and print things out in the high school library that I thought were significant enough to keep, like that anarchy.
I have a table in my office. It was originally intended to be a coffee bar, and I never got around to finishing the coffee bar, and it's stacked 2 feet high with printouts of things that I don't want to lose.
Oh yeah.
And you were saying earlier about your generation. Now, I feel blessed to have the life I've had, and I cannot, like you said earlier, there's certain things about my life that I'm glad I was born. My decision to leave was out of a sense of idealism of the way I think things should be and how I wanted to have a family. But I don't have, the biggest student loan I had was $5,000. Everything else was scholarships, grants, work study. I got paid to get educated. So I was grateful for that. In my graduate work, 1990, I want to say it's probably 1993, 1994, maybe as late as 95. I was sitting in a advanced database design class, because one of my other specialties was database design, not database like administration, but we actually built database systems as part of the class. And the professor came in, and our school had a National Science Foundation grant to get the internet in like 95. And he came in one day, and he just looked at us and he said, "This internet can't stay open. They're going to have to censor it." 95.
Yeah. Wow.
And I remember thinking at the time, no, we shouldn't. And I knew what the internet was like early on. It was, as I would say back then, 15% treasure, 85% garbage.
Yeah. Well, there was a fair amount of sifting you had to do. I remember my favorite website was Stumble Upon, because it would just take you to a random website based on genre.
I think I remember that one.
I loved it. And you know what? Curiously enough, it got bought out by some company who thought they could do it better, and they made it worse. And now, no one wants to use it.
Yeah.
They took out all those conspiracy theory pages too, curiously enough.
I wonder why they would do that.
Yeah. So, but yeah, you remember Stumble Upon. Stumble Upon was so fun. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride, and the internet, distributed technology, has been something I've always been interested in. Back in LimeWire, BitTorrent, and all of that just led up into Bitcoin. Now cryptocurrencies in general, IPFS, I know that there are some dark things on the horizon, but there's some amazing tools to keep things open
Now,
and uncensored.
Now, IPFS, I mean, this is a concept I think the average person probably has no idea. If we could, I'm not
Sure.
exactly an internet tech, genius, but to me, from my perspective, my limited perspective, I would say you're very close to that, Matt. So if you could give us your best definition of IPFS.
Well, really, in my opinion, it's best to understand what BitTorrent is first before we try to talk about IPFS. BitTorrent was the idea back in the early 2000s that to overcome bandwidth caps, what you would do is you would create many connections to many people providing a file so that each one would only have to provide a small amount of bandwidth. And ISPs can't really limit that. They can't limit traffic on small individual connections. That way you could get a very fast, efficient download of a large file that was shared across what was called a swarm. Now, early on, what they would do is everyone who wanted to share a file would give their IP address into a database on a website. And then your torrent program would go with a code for that file and look up all the IP addresses for that file and then initiate this transfer. Well, this became a point because of piracy. This became a point in which these sites were getting shut down. So they invented what was called a distributed hash table, which was essentially a way of bootstrapping the process across the same swarm to get which one of those clients actually had the file and initiate the process of transferring. So the next logical step was, well, why do we need to look for individual files? Why couldn't I just provide an entire file structure for the entire planet and use those hash codes to link into like a global disk? And that's IPFS, and that's why it's called interplanetary file system.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Because I think this is the type of know-how, and if you have the awareness that this exists, that's the first step. I really think that the internet is going to remain a place for free thought, despite, what country you're in right now. I mean, so many people benefit from the freedom of speech that we have in America in a country where they might not have freedom of speech because the information that they're able to access that comes from this country, and that's what this whole, not to go back to mainstream media topics, but that Arab Spring, and apparently now there's another Arab Spring coming, or it's like, obviously, when people have access to a free flow of information, they want to change their government and make their communities a better, more livable place, right? And if you're living under,
Right.
this kind of colonization that takes place, this backdoor colonization where they assassinate any nationalist leader in favor of a globalist leader to run these countries. And like we touched on at the beginning, the Philippines, despite having that kind of colonial force, is very still decentralized. And I think the landscape plays a big part of that. I mean, the islands, the isolated but connected nature of the culture is very, very unique and interesting. And it almost reminds me of the internet in a way. You're out there on this.
And there are people here who, because of a lack of information, are trying to get rid of these tribal structures and create a national identity. And what I think maybe the bonus here is that with this ability to communicate the problems of globalism, I think we'll see some of these people changing their minds about this.
Right.
And I know within our own situ, within our own environment, what we try to do is think inward and outward. So we build up the community that's right adjacent to us. We make sure that we have good relationships as good as possible with neighbors. and that we know people nationally, and then we reach out globally. And I am conscious of trying not to impose an outside idea that's just going to be harmful to my local environment.
Right.
For instance, pharmaceuticals, I'm very much against, and I can tell you, we spent a whole show just talking about horror stories of replacing indigenous medicines with external,
Allopathic.
first world sort of pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
Right, exactly, allopathic medicine.
Homeopathic versus allopathic. And yeah, Matt, I'm with you, man. I think, and that's why I love learning about the little ins and outs of the folk, lore of a place and the magic of the land, because I really truly believe that that's where the herbs and the land, the plants that you eat directly in your own environment, that's part of where their health and nutrition comes from, is that interconnectedness of it all. And pharmaceuticals are so global and disconnected from the whole. It's just disgusting.
That's a good thing to bring up. If you look at the official record here, they don't talk about death. They only talk about cases. They don't talk about death. Well, why? Because we have a lot of sunlight. We're relatively close to the equator.
Right.
Which means our vitamin D levels are really high.
Right.
We eat abundant amounts of citrus fruits, or things high in vitamin C are really high in our diet, because this place is like the Garden of Eden, practically. In fact, amongst some Pentecostal Christian groups here, they really do say that this is the original Garden of Eden.
Yeah, and that kind of connects some of the dots that Ari Esselin was talking about. I mean, I don't expect to get too deep into that, because it is a lot of new theories that Ari is cooking up himself, but I definitely encourage you to check that out. I know you've given me a lot of homework over the course of us talking, so I'll serve some back to you, Matt.
And I'm happy to get some from you.
Yeah, no, to mention a few, there was a channel you mentioned associated with that.
Kasai Zion.
Right.
Yeah. And we haven't even tapped the surface of that one, because the Kasai Zion hunters talk about connections not only with the Celts, but they show these really strange artifacts found in the southern island of Mindanao, which indicate there may have been Phoenicians here, there may have been Greeks here in the past. Very interesting stuff.
Yeah, no.
Whenever Magellan came, the natives of the Visayas made armor out of carabao horn.
Out of what? I missed the last.
Carabao horn, the water buffalo, carabao.
Okay, carabao. Yeah.
The big long horns, right? This is one reason the Spanish had difficulty, because carabao horn was strong enough to resist muskets.
Wow.
But what's interesting on top of that is the way that they would cut the horn was similar to the way Greek armor was made. So sometime in the past, there may have been some exposure to the ancient Greeks here.
Interesting. Wow. And this is...
So like really a crossroads.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is definitely bringing to mind some of the things I spoke about with Brad Olson and other guests, and I think Birch Driver as well, Andreas Zertis it was, and how, ocean routes were the true highways of the ancient world, navigating the coast. You really can, when you look at the map, you can see how easy it would be to almost get to all these places if you just knew where, what coast to follow. It might take you a while, but it's all connected via coast.
Cool. Yeah, was there another point that we need to bring up? Yeah, whenever my mother-in-law, my dearly departed, she died about three years ago. that's here. She died because of allopathic medicine. That's what killed her. Whenever she was, because she was like 84 when she died, and she'd been doing quite well until her doctor died. And her doctor knew how to do everything the native way, but whenever she got on statins, immediately, as soon as she took her first one, it's like she started acting crazy. I mean, really, first dose, she lost her mind.
Wow.
And when they were telling us about it over the phone, and we were like, get her off of those. We had them read to us what medications they were giving her. I'm like, nope, no statins, don't take that. As soon as she stopped taking it, she got her mind back.
Yeah.
And whenever she died, whenever she was in the hospital, the first thing they did was like, oh, she's got to take statins. And she died a few hours later, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Hypersensitivity to these toxins that are passed off is curative.
Yeah, and it's almost like here in America we're so saturated with toxins that it's like, they try to bandage wounds with more toxins, like it's just they're not treating the real root causes. I mean, I myself,
they're disguising the symptoms.
Yeah. I try to stay outside as much as I can because most of my work is in front of a computer. So if I'm not balancing that time away from, the electricity, I feel like it really does have a negative effect on my health. I think we are light beings. We exist with frequency and vibration, and we need to be very careful of the subtle energies around us. And that's why when we talk about the Philippines, it really just gets me excited because I can only imagine, the opportunity there is still there to engage with the land in that way. Like, for example, yesterday I drove an hour or so to get to a place where there was no cell service because of that effect.
Wow.
And
that is one problem we have here. A cell phone's just saturated, so there really isn't much place you can go unless you're out in the ocean and get away from a cell phone.
Yeah, well, there's not much they can do for Western Mass. It doesn't seem like anybody's getting cell phone service up there, at least in the parts I was. But yeah, I don't know. But
well, I was in one of the most beautiful remote areas here up in the mountains. It's the highest point in northern Luzon. It's called Mount Pulag. And I went there twice in the last 10 years. And I got up there, and what do they have? Smack dab, practically at the peak, was a cell phone tower.
Oh, man. Yeah, and do they decorate them like trees over there, too?
Yeah, pretty much. They're all over the place. And I guess the only upside is I seriously doubt we're going to have 5G up nationwide anyway. We might have it in, say, like a business district or something like that. But nationwide, no, we're not going to have 5G anytime soon here. So those high frequency types of transmissions are probably not going to get here for 10, 15, 20 more years. It's just too much infrastructure cost to do something like that. We are, though, getting a lot of fiber. Fiber. I tell you, during the lockdowns, they started rolling out fiber like crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to learn how I can get an off-the-grid internet connection because I'm thinking about getting as far away from the 5G because I'm in the infrastructure, Matt. Like they are last year during the lockdown, I was speaking to this chick that worked at AT&T, and I asked her about it. I'm like, what's been going on at the job? And she's like, oh, well, we've been installing 5G in all these schools now that the kids are out of, the lockdown. Or, they're out of school for the lockdown. So, yeah, and there's probably like 8 or 9 schools in my town alone. So, that's one spot where, there's 5G going on, and I'm sure everywhere in between. So, yeah, I'm definitely getting a little bit of wanderlust, Matt, as we're talking here about your exotic locale. It's definitely very interesting, the thoughts that
We
go
know that.
mind.
I think the thing to remember about going anywhere like here, it doesn't have to be here, it could be another developing nation, is figure out what the local, these are the unwritten rules. Figure out how things work, because the written rules often contradict what actually happens in practice. And respect those rules, because those are the ones that will get you in trouble. If you break those will get you in trouble. A lot of expats come here and think that they can just, do whatever they want. It doesn't really work out that way. You've got some unwritten rules you really have to follow, and if you break those, then you're going to have a headache. And I just let my family here. They know what those rules are before I do. And sometimes I figure them out. Sometimes I have to be taught by them. But I would say it's true anywhere. I talked to people in New Jersey, and they're like, well, we can't go anywhere because of this, that, and the other. I'm like, you know what? I guess you might think that, but maybe it isn't quite that bad. Maybe you're imposing that restriction on yourself, and you're not thinking, how can I step outside of these official guidelines and break them and just get away with it. My brother in Kentucky, because Kentucky has all of these lockdown things, and like he's only worn a mask once in all of it. He did all of his grocery shopping. All he did was, I just order it. I order it, I go pick it up. We found other places for him to buy. I think we should be keeping our eyes open and looking at things in as many different angles as we can and trying to understand what's actually happening. And definitely don't believe what the official pronouncements are. That's crazy.
Yeah. Well, with that, Matt, I think this is going to be the first of many. We're definitely having you back. It's getting late over here. I know it's early for you out there, but it's getting quite late over here. And
I saw you yawning there.
Don't take that personally. Come on now. But
no, I don't.
But that's I do want to have you back on. Maybe get a little more rest. I did have quite the day yesterday. But yeah, Matt, this has been fun.
Sure, I enjoyed it, and I welcome the opportunity. And maybe next time we might actually have an even better setup here, because we are going to be launching a podcast for Content Safe. It's going to be called Deplatformed.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. Well, thank you for tuning in to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, folks. Please go support Matt Raymer. He's on Content Safe, and Deplatformed is the new podcast coming out. Matt, when's that coming out?
1st of July.
The 1st of July. Look at that. I love it. Well, I hope you will join us in the Alt Media United Cooperative with that. And I think, with the timing of this episode, we'll probably release it when Deplatformed is already out. So where can folks find Deplatformed? Is that going to be on the traditional podcast hosts, all the podcast apps and whatnot, or is it going to be on like a video service? What are your plans for it?
It'll be a video service, but we'll probably break off audio-only versions. And the site is already up. If you want to go look at our site, it's deplatformed.co.
Awesome.
And we're preparing our plans already with Daryl Becker. He's going to be one of my co-hosts. And I'm really excited about it. It's going to be really fun and a great opportunity to reach out and network with folks like you, as well as people I haven't met yet.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and I'm excited to see where that takes you, because I know Content Safe is already working with some really amazing people. And if you have a podcast out there, I definitely recommend you perk your ears up for this, because Matt is definitely helping out folks in our genre. Anybody who has a concern for free speech. If you don't know what Content Safe does, I mean, they do a lot, But to sum it up, I mean, I would say it's the most secure way to back up your content if you're a content creator. So please, folks, support Matt Raymer and check out Deplatformed, deplatformed.co. And with that, folks, thank you for tuning in to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast.
Motherfuckers, it's a beautiful day to be alive. It's Monday.
You're listening to My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast.
Dead because Mark is bananas.
Host Mark Palmer.
Yes, you start participating in the real, and it's not that the level or the intensity. Well, maybe it's the intensity because your awareness increases, so you're just sort